Okay. All right, good evening. Wow, that's loud. That's because that's on. All right. Let's do this. Let's do this. Does anybody have any prayer requests before we start tonight? Anybody? How's Sally doing?
At the house.
She's at the house?
Yeah.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Anybody else? Yeah, Connie. Oh, goodness. That's your aunt. Y'all continue to remember Leah. She's finally feeling better. They diagnosed her with walking pneumonia and an ear infection, which is what she's had for the last 4 or 5 days. And so she's had 2 shots and is on a Z-Pack. So she's finally starting to feel better, which is great. So, anybody else? Nobody? Okay. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. John Carroll, will you open us up with the word of prayer? Amen. All right, if you got your Bibles with you, let's turn to Hebrews chapter 11. I think that's where Don left off last week. There's so much stuff in this one book. We'll get about halfway through it tonight, maybe. Yeah, he told me he was handing me off Hebrews 11 today. So, regardless, that's what we're doing because that's what I studied. So. All right, and I briefly mentioned this on Sunday that Hebrews 11 is, I call it the Faith Hall of Fame because they go through all these pillars of the faith and what they did and how they did it. And so what I'm going to do is we're just going to kind of go through a verse or two at a time and kind of unpack it, and we'll see how far we get, okay? All right, so we're in Hebrews chapter 11. Somebody read for me verses 1 and 2. Okay, so it's the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And yours says this is what the elders were, what? Verse 2, the elders were what? I'm taking good testimony, okay? And NIV says commended. And so a couple of things here, like I think a lot of times we look at faith as like this hope. Like when we think about what is faith, like to live by faith, to have faith. Faith is like this hope, and that's what oftentimes we think about. Well, I've got faith in this thing, or faith is hope. But almost like it's a gamble. Like I'm just going to put my faith in this thing, and hopefully it works out. Almost like we're taking a gamble on it, or imply some type of uncertainty. But these verses imply like a solidity to faith, that this is something they actually like stood upon in the midst of everything else, that it was the one solid thing in the midst of everything else being moving, right? And so, because it said it is being sure, right? Being certain. And so it implies this concreteness in our Christianity and our faith. And I like that it calls them the elders, and NIV it calls them the ancients. And we're talking about Christians here. They're all people who trusted in God when things were impossible to see what would happen. And I think we misuse a passage a little bit later in there that's actually referring to them. If you look at chapter 12 real quick, verse 1, right? Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, right? These witnesses are these elders to whom are referred in chapter 11, right? In other words, he goes through this whole list of these are all these people who did all these things for God and trusted him and by faith did these things. And he gets done running through this gamut. And as we actually get to the end of chapter 11, you'll see this author says, well, I don't even have time to talk about all these other people that did awesome things. Okay, but then he goes, therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, like these were all witnesses to God's faithfulness, right? And I think a lot of times we can misuse and misinterpret that verse to apply to a lot of different things. But it's really just saying, because we've had so many people go before us that have done so many amazing things by putting their trust and faith in God, that we need to do the same. All right? Okay, so the first two verses, again, just recognize that these ancients that he's about to address in just a minute are also those witnesses he refers to in chapter 12, verse 1. All right, so we're in verse 3, okay, and if somebody would somebody read that verse for me. Okay. Now, this is actually, it's actually amazing that this is in the Bible, right? Because the concept of something being made out of nothing, right? So the things that are seen were made by things that are not seen, right? And the idea that everything was made from nothing, because we can't even comprehend nothing. You know what I mean? Like if I said, think of nothing, we can't, because if we think of something, it's not nothing. You know, just the absence of anything, time, space, matter, like we can't really fathom that. But yet, here we know that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Like God created everything out of nothing, right? And yet, what's funny about this, and that's by faith we believe this, because we can't see it. We weren't there. We don't know. But by faith, we trust that when God said, He created it all. But what's really funny about this is I believe this concept, that everything was made from nothing, is actually something that most believers and non-believers agree on. They just disagree on the agent that caused it. You know, because even those who don't believe in God will say, well, that nothing's not actually nothing. That's what science says now. That nothing is actually just really, really teeny tiny somethings. Right? That's what their way of explaining how it's created. But yet I do believe that's kind of where we all come from, that same spot. Well, somehow we got here. We shouldn't have, but we got here. And we believe that it was God, and we put our faith in Him. Okay, verse 4. Now we're going to get into these people, okay, and we're going to kind of unpack this and see what it has to say about us. Somebody read verse 4 for me. Okay, so in this, why we're Abel's sacrifice, by he being dead, why were Abel's sacrifices so much better than Cain's? Right, because if we go back and look at it, we know that Abel brought the first of his flock. He brought, an animal, killed it, offered it up before God. And what did Cain bring? His what? Yeah, his grain offering, okay, his harvest offering. Nothing wrong with that. Like, nothing wrong. It wasn't what God wanted, right? And what's the significance? Yeah, go ahead, Don. Good. Right. That's exactly right. And so I think again, we can look at these stories, because remember, these are being mentioned in the New Testament, which I love. So the New Testament itself is testifying to the value of the Old Testament and these saints. And so we're here seeing that a sacrifice that's more pleasing unto God is one that sacrifices blood, that sacrifices life, because sin requires death, like he said. And what's easier for us to give, our possessions or our life? What's easier? Our possessions, right? And so here we have Abel with the understanding that blood has to be sacrificed, something I'm not going to get back. I'm going to have to. That's right. What are you going to say, John? Right. Don't we see here, though, foreshadowing from the very get-go why Abel's sacrifice was better? Because God ultimately was going to sacrifice. He was going to shed blood on our behalf. That none of the sacrifices we could give of our own would be sufficient, but only the death of something would be sufficient. Okay? Let's go to verses 5 and 6. If somebody would. Okay, so it's interesting because Enoch is one of only 2 people in Scripture we know that did not die. Right? And who was the other? Elisha. Okay, and interestingly enough, Enoch actually wrote a book. Okay, and it's actually mentioned in the book of Jude, and the book of Enoch, and supposedly wrote a book. But like I said, it's mentioned in Jude, so we take it at value. But there's a lot we can learn from these 2 verses right here about Enoch. Right? Because remember, what was the penalty of sin? Death. Was Enoch not a sinner? Yes, he was a sinner, right? We know that Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned, right? Everyone. In Romans 5, there's no one good, not one, no one righteous. Romans 6:23, what is the punishment for sin? Death. So why didn't Enoch die? Why? How? You're right. How did he please God? By faith. Right? Foreshadowing. How do we receive salvation? Through faith alone. Right? Again, all this stuff in the Old Testament is screaming about the reality of what's found in Christ. And so, because it not only does it tell us that his faith pleased God, but that it's impossible to please God without it. Right? So again, even if we offer the sacrifices that Abel offered, we still can't please God to be with God except through faith. And so we're seeing this even from the earliest times, that Enoch's faith in God, and it tells us, and we can imply by verse 6 that he must have been earnestly seeking God, right? Because those who have faith in God and earnestly seek him will what? Receive his rewards. And so now we know that Enoch is with God because of his faith in God. Right? And so again, that's a great lesson for us that is true to the New Testament church, is that we please God through faith in Jesus Christ. Right? All right. Let's see. Verse 7. Somebody read that for me. Okay, and so remember, as we read these, on each one of these passages that says, by faith Abel, by faith Enoch, by faith, remember our definition of faith from the very beginning, right? Evidence of things hoped for and the certainty of those things not seen, right? So by that, this evidence of things hoped for, the certainty of things not seen, by that faith, they did these things. And so again, when Noah warned about things not yet seen, and holy fear built an ark to save his family, and by his faith he condemned the world. What do you think it means by his faith he condemned the world? What do you think? Okay. Because when we think about this, like, what did Noah do? Because remember, it says, when warned about things not yet seen. Right. Okay, I can see that.
Had they not had an example of faith, would they have been condemned? They had an example of faith, and they ignored that example. That brought the condemnation.
I just wonder, because again, there's a whole lot of Noah's story that we don't get to see, which is unfortunate. But I just wonder how many conversations he had with people when they're like, why are you doing this? He's like, because God said we're all wicked and we deserve to die. And he's going to flood the earth, you know. Like, I just wonder if that conversation ever took place, you know.
Peter said that he was a preacher of righteousness, and so we know that during that period of time he was proclaiming and preaching the coming event,
Okay.
and they ignored it.
So, yeah. So think about it. So by his faith, he condemned the world. Now, he was warned about things not yet seen, but what is faith? It's the evidence of things not yet seen. Okay? And so he is preparing. So faith creates preparation. So he believes it's going to flood because God said it's going to flood. And so he prepared for it, right? In the midst of his preaching righteousness, he prepared to take care of his. And he did what God asked him to do. And so one thing we can ask ourselves in this is, you know, what are we doing on behalf of our family? You know, what ark are we building in the midst of the world that we're in right now? You know, what are we doing to get ready for them? Yeah. We're in Hebrews 11, ladies. And gentlemen. Walked in. Sorry, Mac. I'm wondering what his teenage sons were thinking. Like, are you kidding me, Dad? Like, yeah, but they did. That's right. That's right. Right. Yeah. I do wonder, though, if the kids were like, but what if he's right? I wonder if the kids were like, this is stupid. But what if he's right? Like, just keep working. And so, again, preparation. Okay, faith requires that, or faith creates that, I should say, because we believe of evidence of what's not seen. So we are working towards what we can't see. We're doing what we need to do. And then at the same time, action is going to claim God's truth. I believe when we look at this and it says his faith condemned the world because they watched him do it. They watched him build this boat. And when the rains came, they knew. Like they knew. See, he already knew beforehand, right? His faith was evidence of things not seen. He already knew it was going to do this. They didn't until it happened. Right? And then they're like, oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean. Yeah, I would. I mean, I would assume that at the very least, that they believed their dad at the very least. You know, but I would think so. Yeah, like she said, obey. But I do think that they wouldn't have gone along with it. You know, if they didn't at least believe something of what he was doing. There's not even going to be any plug-ins on this boat. Can't charge my phone. But I do think this also implies, too, because God didn't speak to his family. God spoke to Noah, right? And I think it's important for us to recognize what role we play in the salvation of other people, that we have a role to play in this, right? Because Noah didn't save them, the ark did. But it was Noah's obedience to build the ark that saved his family, right? And so Noah also doesn't condemn them, but by his faith, it condemns them because they see the reality of what he's been doing. All right. Verse 8. And Abraham's like the hero of this chapter, by the way. He's like the main character because he gets about half the chapter here. Somebody read verses 8 through 10. All right. So, when God says go, do we? You know what I mean? Because what do we know about Abraham here? Like, where did God tell him to go? To a land he had chosen, but did he tell him where it was? No, right? So Abraham's like, okay, and he just goes. Like, he has no idea where he's going, right? But he's just going. Why? Because God told him to. You know, God promised him, I'm going to give you this inheritance. And if you go back and read that story, we talked about that before, you know, God had made his covenant with Abraham, like he had assured him that this was going to happen and all this, but he believed. And interesting enough, he made his home in a foreign country, you know, in tents, so nothing permanent, right? Because he believed that God was going to prepare a city for him, a place for him, right? And I think that's really interesting to realize we don't have to know where we're going in order to be obedient to God. You know, I think we see that best in the book of Isaiah when he says, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And Isaiah says, here, my Lord, send me. Like, he didn't ask where he was going, what he was going to do. He just said, I'll do it, you know. It'll change quick. It'll change quick. Been changed and yeah. Well, it's interesting too, because if you go read that story about Abraham when he called him out, and we talked about this a couple of nights ago on Sunday night, when he calls him out, like, he only goes out with two people. Like, he calls him out of his country, and he leaves with who? Does anybody know who he left with? His wife and his nephew Lot. That's it. Took everything they had, all their stuff, you know, and they left. And they left with all of it. Not knowing where they're going. So, I mean, Lot and his wife must have really trusted him. You know, and again, when we have faith in God, it affects other people. Like, we need to understand that, what the importance of that. It's not just us. Like, it's beneficial for the others too. And it helps them out. All right. Verse 11, let's see, somebody read 11 and 12 for me. Again, it's still about Abraham. Okay, so by faith, Abraham, even though he's past age, and that's just a nice way of saying he was real old, okay? And then we're not talking about like Hugh Hefner old. We're talking about like old. Like that doesn't happen anymore, okay? You're not going to have babies. It's just not going to happen. And her being barren on top of it, right? So not only is she old and past age, she's barren and can't have them anyway, right? And so we have an impossible situation here. And yet God says, I'm going to give you a child. That's why Sarah laughed, right? When God's like, you're going to be pregnant. She's like, yeah, right. Yeah. And yet, here we have, by faith, they trusted, and they became pregnant. And from this one man, I love it says, and from this man, verse 12, and he as good as dead. Like, he was that old. Like that old. Like, he was as good as dead. But again, think about the spiritual implications of that statement. He was as good as dead, and God brought life from him. Is that not the story of our lives? As good as dead, actually dead, and yet he brings life out of us, you know, which is an amazing thing. And so, do we take God at his word, even if it's impossible? Abraham absolutely did. And these are things we're supposed to be learning because therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, like, we need to recognize what they did, right? So that we can also do these things. So he trusted God even when it seemed impossible. And we go on. All right, verse 13. Somebody read just verse 13, okay? Okay, now who are all these people that they're referring to right here? Yeah, and that's important because the verse before it is talking about all the children of Abraham, but that's not who we're talking about. It's talking about every by faith we just talked about. So Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, all these people were still living by faith when they died. And I love this phrase here because I really think, we got to understand and get a grasp of what this means, okay? What does it mean to live by faith? Because think about what they said. They're living by faith when they died. What does that mean? Right. For their entire life. But remember, when they died, what were they still looking forward to? The promises. Right? So by faith, they were looking for the evidence of things hoped for, right, or the substance of things hoped for, and the evidence of things not seen, right? Their faith was on this distant promise, not just for them, right? Yes? This lady's a neuroscientist, just to give you a heads up, okay? Yeah. Yeah, I remember her talking about that at the training. She talked about how when we have thoughts that as we continue to think, whether they're negative or positive, whatever they are, as we think about them, they create formations in our brain. And if you imagine your brain is like a Christmas tree and it keeps branching out, right? As you come up with a thought, another little branch comes, like a concrete thought, and you focus on it, it creates a little. So basically what it does is the more you think about something, the more real it becomes to you because it's actually creating a spot in your brain. Right, and so think about this for just a minute, how deep this is. Remember when Jesus said, you've heard it said not to commit adultery, but I tell you, if you look at a woman lustfully in your heart, or if you look at a woman lustfully, you've committed adultery with her in your heart. Because when you think about that, it creates it in your brain, and so it is real. It's not. We think thoughts are just these ethereal things that come and go, but when you focus on something, it creates a real substance in your brain. But at the same time, go ahead. So think about faith. If I believe God's promise for me, and I believe what He said to me, and my focus is on that promise, what's it doing in my mind? It's creating a real thing to me. And the more I focus on it, the more real it becomes, right? And it is now the substance of things hoped for. And it's the evidence of things not seen. Yeah. Right. So with that being said, so think about how we're walking through this by faith. Okay, we've talked about the right type of sacrifice. We've talked about faith being the way to please God. Right? Think about how this is walking us through now. Right? Jesus dies. We must put our faith in Him. Then we get to Noah, who has to do, he has to obey, he has to build, he has to protect, he has to be outward in his faith. right? We see Abraham, who is called to go where God's. Notice Noah wasn't ever called to go. He was called to do, right? And Abraham is called to go. And God makes a promise, and we see God's faithfulness through Abraham. And all of these people, they died living by faith because of what they were focused on out ahead of them, right? So we have to ask ourselves, are we living by faith? And that's hard for us to ask now because I don't know how many of us, myself included, have something that we feel God has promised us out here that we're focused on. Paul gives us an easy one when he says, I've not yet obtained it. But this thing I know is that I strive ahead to grasp what's ahead of me, that Christ Jesus has took forward me into heavenward. Like, so our focus, our promise is heaven. And so that's our focus. And we're trying to fill our nets as we go with as many people to go with us as we can, but this is always our focus. So even when we die, we're living by faith, believing in the promise God has for us that we've not yet received, right? And I think a lot of people want their promise right now. Give me my inheritance now, kind of thing. When he's saying, I've got something out for you here. And notice what happens with Abel, with Enoch, with Noah, with Abraham, the effect that they have on all the people around them because of their faith. Like this ripple effect that happens, all right? Okay, moving on. We're going to skip down to verse 17. And this is still one of the strangest, but one of my favorite stories in Scripture, and it's actually what we talked about in small groups 2 weeks ago. Somebody read 17 through 19. Is that not the craziest story? I mean, like, if you're not familiar with that story, like, take a moment to read it, and you'll think for a moment Abraham was just absolutely out of his mind. Like, we talked about that last week, didn't we, Brianna, about how people would look at Abraham and put him in jail now. They saw him up on his roof fixing to slash his son, and he was like, God told me to do it. You know, people would put him in jail, right? But yet, we know here he is, and if we backed up that Abraham had been given Isaac, even though he was as good as dead, you know, he was so old, and yet he gives him this child, and it's going to be the only child he ever has, and it's going to be a child of many nations, and God solidified this promise by sacrificing those animals and walking through them with the fire, saying, I promise unto myself that this will take place. And so then he goes, oh, and by the way, I want you to go kill him. Sacrifice him to me. And Abraham's like, okay. Because it says, if you read the story, it says the next day, they went and gathered wood and took his people with him, his servants, and they went to find the place that God had sent them to do this. And so they get up there, and it says that Abraham's mind, because if you read the story, there's a couple times that Abraham's faith is put out. Because when they stop with his servants, he says, you all wait here. We're going to go up to the mountain to worship, and we'll be back. We will be back. If he's going to leave him up as a burnt offering, he's not coming back with him unless he believes something is going to happen. God's going to intercede or do something crazy. So then he gets up there, and on the way, you know, Isaac is not a dumb kid. He's an older fella. You know, he's at the very least an old teenager, okay? And he's walking up, and he's like, Dad, there's 3 things we need here, and we got 2 of them, but there's no lamb. Like, where's the lamb we're going to sacrifice? And his dad goes, God will provide it, son. God will provide it. Right? Well, that's the part I really wonder about when he's actually tying up his son, roping him up. Dad, not funny, Dad. Like, the joke's over, and he lays him up on the altar, right? And I just can't imagine that moment. That I mean, Abraham's like fully believing God's going to take care of this. He's going to provide the lamb. We're going to come back. We'll be back. This is worship, you know. Like, we're worshiping right now, and I don't know about Isaac, but so he's about to kill him. And what happens? The angel says, "Stop! I'm just testing you." I hope God never tests me like that, you know. But he says, I was just testing you. And then what do they find in the thicket? The ram. Okay? And so he believed God would provide the lamb. He did. And guess what? He and Isaac came back down from the mountain to be with his servants, just like he said they would. But why? What was going through his mind? Well, it tells us here that Abraham reasoned. And I think that's insane because it wasn't like he was like, man, how's God going to do this? Like, this is crazy. What do we do? It said he reasoned. He thought out in his mind. He's like, okay, this is my only son, and millions, all these people are going to come from him, and God promised it, and God can't lie, but now he wants me to kill him. Okay, so I'm going to kill him, and then God's going to bring him back to life. That was his reasoning, right? That's faith. That's faith. And I mean, like I said, nowadays we'd look at that and be like, that's stupid. Really. But that's faith. And this is because we're supposed to understand that God can do immeasurably more than we could ever imagine. Do we reason out our faith? And I'm going to ask you it this way. Do we reason out our faith based on our experiences with God and on God's abilities, or on our experiences with the world and our abilities? Because that's where it's going to come down to. God had already showed up faithful for Abraham. God had already made Abraham have a child when that shouldn't even have happened. Couldn't have happened, right? And so that wasn't in Abraham's ability. Definitely wasn't in Sarah's ability. Like, she was unable. She was not able to do this, and yet they had it. So what did he do? He trusted in God's faithfulness and his experience with God and God's ability. That's faith. That's faith. And that's something we can learn from this. And what does Jesus say in Luke 1:37? He says, the angel says this to Mary, with God all things are possible. With God all things are possible. All right, I got two more people I want to talk about real quick. Verse 20, I'm going to read it. It says, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. And I think this is interesting because I was thinking about this today. When a father blesses his child, it's not like God blessing us. It's not like Isaac had like special powers to like endow him with certain strength or anything like this. But he gives him his blessing, in other words, what he can give him, right? And I think God can give us understanding, and he gave them understanding what's going to happen. But Esau kind of got the raw end of the deal, didn't he? At least it seems. It seems. Because he was the older brother. He should have got the blessing. He should have got this. But he had already given up his birthright. He had already sold his birthright out for some stew, right? Now, unless it was like one of Denise's cheesecakes, I'm not giving up my birthright, okay? Right? But yet he did. And then after that, he gets tricked, right, by Rebecca and by Rebecca and by mom and by his brother to give up, and they steal his blessing from his father. So we know Jacob was blessed by Isaac with all the things that he would normally give to the firstborn. But Esau, what was his blessing? As he came to his dad and he was like, Dad, give me something. He's like, what can I give you? I've already given your brother everything. And he's like, certainly you have one thing to give me. And he said, I'll tell you what, you're going to be under your brother for the longest of times. You're going to live and die by the sword. He said, but one day you're going to be able to throw off your brother's, off his yoke from on top of you, and you're going to be able to stand on your own. And we find that come to fruition as Jacob runs from him, and later on they come back together. And Jacob's trying to give him all this. I've got all this. Just take all this. And Esau's like, brother, I got plenty. Like, we're good. Let's be okay, because God had blessed him, right? But Isaac believed. By his faith, he said, God's going to take care of you. He's going to take care of both of you, right? By faith, he blessed them. And it's important that we know that God is the giver. God is the giver of good things, not us, okay? And this last one, I really want to finish on this one because it's an interesting little dynamic, but it's also, I'll give you a random fact from the Bible today as we come to a close. I love doing that. All right, verse 21. Somebody read 21 for me. Okay. Who can tell me the names of Joseph's sons? Ephraim and Manasseh, okay? And does anybody know like the dynamic there of how this blessing took place? Because it was very Jacob and Esau-ish. Right, okay? So here we have Joseph brings his sons to his dad Jacob, and Jacob puts his hand on Ephraim's head. Ephraim's the younger, right? And so Joseph's like, no, Dad, hold on. And he puts his hand on Manasseh. He said, he's the older brother. And Jacob goes, I know. And he puts his hand back on Ephraim's head. And he said, don't worry, Manasseh will be blessed too, but not as much as Ephraim. And he blesses him. And so I want to show something to you all tonight, just to kind of give you a heads up on this. But and that's in Genesis 48, if you ever want to read that part. That's when that takes place. But we need to obey and recognize God's promises. And this is what I'm talking about, is he blesses both these boys. When God decides who he wants to bless and how he wants to bless, that's very, very true to the Holy Spirit when we talk about his gifts. Right? We know that the gift is going to give to each one as he has seen fit. Right? That you're going to be blessed with what you need to be blessed with. And we not need to compare ourselves to other people. A blessing is a blessing. But I think it's interesting here that obedience is an example to the future. And here's why I say that. Turn to Deuteronomy 33:17. Deuteronomy 33:17. And while you're there, go ahead and turn to Genesis 48. Yeah, Deuteronomy 33, and then Genesis 48. And you can read the story in Genesis 48. You see at the very beginning of it is when the sons were blessed, and Jacob blesses them. But in verse 20, okay, 48 verse 20 is when we see this. And he says, verse 19. This is when Joseph tried to correct him, put it on Manasseh's head. He's the firstborn. Verse 19, Jacob says, but his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He too will become a people, and he too will become great. So he's blessing Manasseh. Manasseh is going to be a great nation. He's going to be a great multitude. He says, nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations. He blessed them that day and said, now notice, he blessed both of them. So that's the difference between this and Jacob and Esau, right? He blesses both of them at the same time to give both of them. And he says here, in your name will Israel pronounce this blessing. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. So he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. All right, now turn to Deuteronomy 33. And I want to point out something to you. Anytime somebody says or may mention this, people who are scoffers of the Bible, or they want to call something out. In chapter 33 of Deuteronomy, verse 17, does anybody's translation in here say unicorn? Got 1, 2, 3. King James says unicorn, right? So it says, in majesty, he is like a firstborn bull. His horns are like the horns of a unicorn, right? Is that what it says in yours? Okay, so what are we talking about? Now, some might say wild ox. Okay, I'm gonna point out to you that I don't believe it's a wild ox, and here's why. Okay, now, what is it? Why would it say unicorn? If you go, do what? Yeah, that's what mine says too. If you were to go to the Latin Vulgate version of Scripture, okay, so this is an extremely old version of the Bible, written entirely in Latin, a Latin translation from the Greek, okay, from the Hebrew and then from the Greek. And so in that passage right there, instead of wild ox or instead of unicorn, it's going to say something to the effect of rhinoceros, which looks like rhinoceros, okay, and it's the Latin word for rhinoceros. But this is why it's important. There are two types of rhinoceri, okay? And there's a rhinoceros unicornis, right, which is where we get the term unicorn, and we have a rhinoceros bicornis, right? So the unicornis has what? One horn, and it is a big honking horn, okay? And they're very rare, very, very rare, but they're there. The other one is the bicornis, which is the common rhinoceros that we see, right? Because it has what? It has the big horn in front. It's not as big as the unicornis, but it has a big horn here, and then it has that little nub behind it, right? Do I know what I'm talking about? Okay, so keep that in mind. In verse 17, read this along with me. In majesty, he is like a firstborn bull. And just to give you an idea here, Moses is blessing the tribes, right? And so about the tribe of Joseph, this is who he's talking about, okay? It starts back in 13. And he's talking about how God is blessing the tribe of Joseph, and it gets on to verse 17. In majesty, he is like a firstborn bull. His horns are like the horns, and we're going to insert this here, of a bicornis rhinoceros, okay? That's two-horned rhinoceros. This is why I say that. With them, okay, so we know it's more than one horn with them, so it couldn't be just a plain unicorn. With them he will gore the nations, even those at the ends of the earth. Such are, okay? Such are, in other words, he's referring to the horns. Such are the 10,000s of Ephraim. Such are the thousands of Manasseh. Think about your two-horned rhinoceros. Which one is Ephraim? He's the front horn, the 10,000s of Ephraim. And which one is Manasseh? The short horn behind it, the thousands of Manasseh. That's why they're referenced as a unicorn, because that's the same term that was used for rhinoceros since the beginning of our Webster's dictionary. You can go back and look at it. Okay? Really interesting. So when people say, why is there unicorns in the Bible? I would say, because they're rhinoceros and you don't know what a unicorn is. Right? It's not a mythical creature. It's a giant thing you can see in the zoo, you know. So I find that really interesting. But we see, again, Moses is referencing back. And this is why I said obedience is an example to the future. So here we have Moses referencing back the blessing that Jacob gave to Manasseh and Ephraim and saying, you've seen, this is what has happened with the tribe of Joseph, that they have blessed and they have taken over because what? They were blessed. These two were blessed by God, by faith, that they would be two great nations. And we see it take place later on. That's why it's important as we look through this faith chapter is, are we living by faith? Because if we live by faith, it will help others live by faith. And it'll point them in the same direction we go. So if we're focused on our destination and we are passionate about it and we're loving people along the way, but yet we're still going, as people are walking the other direction, occasionally they're going to stop and be like, what are you looking at? You ever done that with people? Walking in a big crowd, just stop and look up. What ends up happening? People start to stop. Try to see what you're looking at, right? Okay? But the question is, how often are we focused on Christ, the author and perfecter of our faith? If we're staring at him long enough, people are going to know what we're staring at. But a lot of times we're looking at the things of the world, we're all around, and we don't stay focused on him. And yet these people by faith, they were focused on the things that they had not yet seen because God had promised it to them. And they lived their lives that way all the way up to the point that they died. So we're going to finish right there at verse 21, and we'll finish the last half of this chapter next week. I encourage you to read it yourselves, see what you gather out of it, and we will go from there. Any comments, complaints, or questions? Yeah. Awesome. Bless your heart. Any other requests or anything before we close up? Yeah, Mac. Carl Sargent. Remember him in the hospital. Anybody else? Anybody? Any unspoken prayer requests tonight as we close? Several. Okay. Let's all stand together and be dismissed. All right. Mike Ferguson, will you close us out?